All right. So if you have any questions, start throwing them in the chats. So the title of this talk, pandemic of groupthink. Do you have any thoughts on that and like how this how this may relate?
Yes. Okay. So there is a huge relation to this, of course, because the big first thesis, the first principle of the modernity of the way that we organize our collective societies is we have this notion that we have all we need to do is get presented the evidence and we will rationally make the right decisions. We have this idea that our brains are this one thing, and the problem with our brains is that the right information has not been put inside of them. That's the thesis. All right, you think about everything that's going on right now and everything in terms of like arguing and like culture and all that type of stuff. It's this idea that people have the wrong things in their head. Think even about the idea of stuff like censorship. You're saying the wrong words. We need to put the right words into your head, and then all those bad emotions will go away. All right. So there's this thesis that you are just a united, enlightened soul, and what goes into your head, information-wise, is what determines your head, and what comes out of your head is a signal of all that. It sees you as a single thing. This is the Enlightenment perspective. Now, what Freud and Jung did is they subverted that. This is why they were such a big deal. Nietzsche did it first, really. And they were suggesting that there's this huge unconscious force that you have to almost develop a relationship with in order to develop a complete character, a complete perspective, a sophisticated perspective. Now, this is a huge problem, because if that's true, that means this thesis of how we become individuals responsible in society as democratic members to guide society towards the good. If we run with the thesis that Freud and Jung presented, that just can't work in the way that we're doing it right now. That cannot work in the way they're doing it right now, because the way education works, where it's just put in information, the way politics works, where it's get the right information, all of that is completely against what Freud and Jung are saying. It just does not work. It does not compute. Now, of course, that's been ditched, but this left brain, right brain stuff is now coming back to haunt us and say there's a serious suggestion that this stuff is real. And then what we start to go down is back to these psychoanalysts, and we start to see stuff like, cognitive dissonance is very famous. That people have already decided what they want and where they want to see things going. They've already decided their positions based on emotional, unconscious reasons. And there's no reasoning with them. There's no reasoning. And this is on all sides and either sides. And we're kind of stuck in this spiral where there'll be a lot of chatter. There'll be a lot of talk. There'll be a lot of the debating. You go on Reddit, you go on Twitter, you'll find plenty of debates about people trying to like show themselves the right information and all that stuff. But that's going to slowly like that maybe very slowly will turn minds, but definitely not as a whole. And that's kind of a scary thing to get into. So if we were to talk about a pandemic of groupthink, I wouldn't necessarily say there's like, one bad perspective and all that, although there's plenty of bad perspectives out there, but more that there's a sort of psychological underpinning, a psychological perspective underpinning this that's putting us in a very scary place. Let's put it that way. So I don't know, does that answer your question?
And when we were chatting before, we're talking about, my area of interest, the culture war and stuff like that. And as I told you, Jordan Peterson was my therapist before he became famous. And it's quite a weird thing seeing your therapist become like a culture warrior. Do you think there's a reason why a Jungian, a psychotherapist went into the culture war the way he did with his analysis?
Oh, it's a good question. That's a very good question, actually. That's a very good question. I think my understanding of Jordan is that he was very, very unconscious of this. So him and Sam Harris had a conversation. And right at the end, the whole thing was crap, to be honest, in my opinion. But right at the end was one of the most lucid and beautiful moments I've seen in the intellectual sphere in a long time. And Sam and Jordan were asked by Douglas Murray, it's like, well, what do you understand as, I think it was evil, okay? And so Sam kind of dribbled and tripped up and all this type of stuff, and he's like, "Oh, that bad thing." I don't know. He said something very, very, very shallow, and you could almost see that there was like it was like a computer trying to give an informative answer. You know what I mean? And then Jordan like literally paused for a moment, and it was almost like it was in his voice. There was this depth and heaviness in his voice, and he made some type of statement that he knew inside of him he could like basically, like the idea of like the shadow, you could hold down on someone's neck and squeeze until they have no life left, and he knew that he had that in him. He knew that there was a absolute lion inside of himself. That's because that's what we are. We're monsters. You know, we have that in us. All of us do. Your nervous system has that in you. Now, this, I think, exposed everything, because Jordan was someone who was aware that his ego, his little bubble up in here of rational consciousness that goes about the day, that is not his entirety. And the thing that drives a lot of his behavior is unconscious, if you will, is in the nervous system or the right brain, whatever you want to call it. And tied to that is for example, the predator can come out when you're in danger and kill someone. If you talk to someone who's ever been in war, they will post-traumatic stress, they'll often say that the experience is an outer body experience. What does that mean? It feels like you're watching yourself killing people. And what does that mean? It's like your ego suddenly lets go and lets the nervous system do what the instincts are good at doing, and it's good at killing stuff. And then suddenly you come back home and you're in shock, because you're like, I just murdered like 40 people. And I didn't even do it. Something else did it for me. This is actually really in alignment with how stuff like traditional paganism works. For example, Odin was the god of the berserk state, which is where the Viking warriors would give themselves up to Odin's energy. What was that? Well, an outer body experience where Odin takes over and he kills people. And he kills people for you. He's the god of war. It's a frightening thing. The god of frenzy. It's a frightening thing, but it's the reality of what humanity is. And Jordan Peterson had a grip on that. And tied to that, predator is also tied to negative feelings. All right. So I go through my whole life, and like, we live in a brilliant society, but that doesn't stop. You know, rationally, it's perfect. All you have to do is work hard and then you reach the top. Rationally, it's perfect. But people aren't rational. And the fact that there's people winning and you're not winning causes you to just get that little ounce of envy and anger. And life is traumatizing in 1,000 different ways. And the trauma gets stored in your nervous system. I'm doing this now as a psychologist. Yeah, resentment. I'm doing this now as a psychologist. I'm like working with people. And you see it all the time. And it's so scary, man, because you sit down with someone and you talk them through what happened to them. There was a woman I was just talking to recently, you know, you're talking through what happened to her. She's telling you that she's just gone through this mad divorce, okay? And she's saying that she's dealt with it. And I talk her back into her nervous system. I talk her out of her left brain or ego into her right brain. And she's rationally explained to me that she's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with her. And I just talk her into it. And I'm not telling her what to think. I'm just asking her to go there. And she just erupts crying, because she's really fucked up still. She's not like broken, but she's just like, it's hard. It's hard to go through stuff like that. You take like 40 punches in the face and stomach throughout like this long year of going through a divorce, and you store all that in your nervous system, and you eventually get over it, and you develop like a sort of ego to help you get through it. And that's not an ego and like arrogance. It's just like, you know, your day to day to finish your to-do list instead of breaking down crying all the time. But then you kind of work into someone and it's still there. And it erupts like energy. And that's the trauma you're picking up. That's the bad energy you're picking up. And we all pick it up. I hate to say it, you know, and we store it in the unconscious, stored in the nervous system, stored in the right brain, whatever you want to say. I don't care about the words. And Jordan Peterson, I believe, was aware that there's a lot of people out there picking up traumatic energy, and there's no psychological way for them to expel that. And when you don't have a psychological conception, if you're stuck in the rational enlightenment idea, all you have to do is think straight, you won't be able to get rid of that bad energy. And so what will happen is that bad energy will boil up inside of you, and as Nietzsche said, it will fester into ressentiment. And then what happens is the bad energy, all emotions want to go in a direction. They all want to go somewhere. Anger wants you to go and destroy someone. Love wants you to go and make love to someone. Resentment wants you to go and destroy someone as well. And it all collects together with a large group of people who have got all this resentment inside of them, and it starts to swell up in this like group, and it's just floating there like this dark cloud. And all it takes is one person to walk over and paint a little picture and say, that's the person who caused that, or that's the archetype, you know, the archetype of the capitalist, or whatever you want to say. That's the person who caused that. And this giant storm cloud of anger swirls on top of that. It's like a magic spell. And then you've got 40 million people who want to murder a certain type of person. And that's when you're in a scary place. That's when you're in, like, you know, the crazy stuff that happened during the 20th century and all that. And it's that simple. It starts from that level. And so I think that's a long answer to your question, but I think that's why Jordan Peterson was so relevant. Okay.